But if we could start with you just introducing yourself, and
Sure.
just telling us a little bit about your story and maybe lead with a lesson, that you have learned or that has guided you.
Okay. Well, I'm in an executive search. I run the global technology practice for SRI, which is a global boutique firm with um, large practices in sport, media and entertainment, consumer, uh, retail, gaming and betting, technology. And so I actually ran a business with my partner, Willa Perlman, and we sold that business to SRI last year. So in 2022. And we came over, Will and I, as co CEOs of North America. And they asked me this year to take on the global technology practice. And I'm like, sure, but what isn't technology? Because I feel like most companies are either tech companies or becoming tech companies. And, I think it was a great opportunity because we have these wonderful, I have now global partners, I have partners throughout all these different regions who want to collaborate and who have great knowledge about the industries they serve. But as the world gets, there's a lot more convergence going on, and we're seeing talent pulled from different industries. So we're able to work together to really help clients find the right people, whether they're sitting in sport or entertainment or technology today. So it's been great. Um, your question about the start. So I started in media and publishing. So, and I think like a lot of kids out of college, you get out in the world and you just don't know what you don't know. And my first job out of school was with WGN Radio, which I thought I had totally made it. I was going to be a radio producer, which just sounded like the living end to me at the time. And then I realized what they made for a living. The hours they put in, some of the talent they dealt with. And I was looking around and I'm like, what do those people do? And they looked much happier and they drove much nicer cars and wore better clothes. And they were advertising salespeople. And I'm like, I can do sales. So um, that wasn't something that was discussed. At the time, nobody was talking about jobs and sales, and it had kind of a negative thing. But I think sales, especially for women, great, because if you can bring in revenue, you are important to your company. So I worked in sales. I was the first one of two women to work for a B2B publishing company with over 60 magazines, and I was one of two women for that. Um, Interesting. The first day that I was there, the manager of the office got a group together at Chicago Athletic Club, which at the time was you could not bring women in or you couldn't be a member. And I'll never forget it, Brooke, because I sat down at the table with all these blue suited colleagues, and the hostess came over with a box of candy and said, "Happy Secretary's Day." So,
Ah,
uh,
wow.
so fortunately, I found my sense of humor and I said, "Well, thank you. I'll give it to my secretary when I get back to the office." So I won some friends that day, but it did kind of set the pace that, you know, we're outnumbered. And it was an interesting thing. And that, even in consumer media, which I moved into later in my career, which did have more women in it, there was still a lot of pressure from that. And it really matters who you work for. So, people ask me how I got into search, and I think it was because of a really bad boss. I was working for um, a very large publishing company where women were the primary readers and consumers. And I was running what was then called integrated media. It was like early data and digital stuff, and working with high-end clients and on both print and in store buys, and all. It was very interesting work. I worked for a great guy, and then they moved him to run a different division, and I was working for his polar opposite afterwards. And never forget it. He came up to me and he said, "I need you out on the golf course, and I want you out for drinks every night." And at this time, had young babies at home. I had young children at home, and my numbers for my team were the highest of any of the groups. Our revenue numbers, our the pipeline. It was a healthy business, and I pointed this out to him, and he turned to me and he said, "I've gotten rid of 7 working mothers in the last year. I can get rid of you too."
Wow.
So I went from this job that I loved to,
Mhm.
about a week later, I got a call from somebody and they said, "Hey, have you ever thought of getting into executive recruitment?" And I'm like, "I haven't, but I will."
Right.
So,
Wow.
I think a company's culture, who you work for, how
Mhm.
you're supported makes a huge difference in a company's ability to to keep talent. And I've never forgotten some of these lessons, and it's helped me in my job today.
That's so cool. And I'll just full disclosure, we met because you recruited me for my first board role, and then I've worked with you on a couple of other searches. And one of my observations about you, both with SRI and your previous company, is that you really look for like values alignment. I mean, that was for me, that was the biggest thing about both the PE firm and the company whose board I joined. And we had a lot of conversations about that, right? And that I really appreciated, because I think especially when you're thinking about board work, but also when you're thinking about taking a senior role. I'm thinking about the last one that we worked on. Like
Yeah.
it's so important to the teams. It's not just about culture fit, right? It's about, is this somebody who I want to like get in the trenches with, who I want to fight alongside and fight for, right?
Right.
Do we, are we aligned? And that doesn't mean we have to like agree about everything, but I feel like, and we've never talked about this, but I'd love to hear about like how do you approach that as a recruiter with candidates, and then how do you approach it working with the companies that you do?
I think I don't want to say easiest. I think the most straightforward thing we do is matching skill sets to a job, right?
Mhm.
That's a little bit more black and white. I think, though, what's really important, and it can be scary at senior levels bringing people into an organization, but that ability to be successful in that environment, to work within that culture, to kind of thrive, and so the way that we do that is we use a lot of different things. One of the things is at the start of any search, our partners do kind of more deep dive interviews with not just the hiring manager, but as many people in the organization as as we can, because you get a better understanding of the types of people. No, they all, in the most healthy cultures, it's not like it's one person, but there's usually these uniting factors that you can pull out and you understand, okay, that's that's what this company is about. These are the kind of people who thrive, even how they communicate, values. So there's a lot that you can get out of these initial interviews that we conduct to really try to understand that. Um, we, I think we interview kind of several times to try to get a better understanding of the candidates. I have some amazing associates who do kind of initials to kind of do some preliminary, but partners are usually doing not only a long interview, but we talk to the candidates throughout. Um, Sometimes you want to push a little bit, if there was something at a red flag, and know how to circle back to that. The other thing, I've done this a really long time now, which has been really helpful, is that I can usually sit when I'm talking to a candidate, and I'm usually writing in the margins of my notes who I know at those companies, and I can do some early referencing.
Mhm.
At senior levels, people should reference really, should know how to sell themselves for a job, right? So I think it's important to try to get some early referencing done before you are presenting a client, and then the client falls in love with that candidate. So we try to do the early referencing. We also, there are different types of interview questions that get more than at kind of what you've done, but how you've done it. And I think that's kind of important. And we also, SRI also has other assessment tools like the Hogan and things
Mhm.
like that that we can apply as an additional layer. And then reference. It's really important.
Yeah. 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 And then, I mean, when we have worked together, diversity's always been a priority, right? And knowing that
Always.
so many companies are making like real time progress here, right? So what was a cultural fit 10 years ago is maybe different today, and what worked for some references may not be what works for, right? So like, how do you factor that in, and then how do you approach bringing a diverse slate of candidates? Because it's such a, I mean, obviously, like if they don't see the candidates, then
Yeah.
there's no even place to start. But I'd love to hear how you approach that.
So, I think being a woman myself, and I tell you, I still hate that in 2023 women are considered diverse, but it is the way of the world. We make up a larger part of the population, but yet,
Mhm.
um, so which I love about Beyond Barriers because you're going to change that. In my own small way, I've been trying to change it as well because, as a woman in business and then as a woman business owner for a long time. Um, Willa and our placement of women and people of color has been always really high because we've always seen women. They're part of our networks. It was not something that was like, oh, that's a novelty. It was real for us. At SRI, it is our job to present a diverse slate of candidates for every shortlist. Now, we don't get to ultimately pick the final candidate. That's the hiring manager's job. But I'm really proud of the fact last year was like 70% of our hires were women or people of color.
Well,
So they're out there, but it's a very purposeful hiring. I think some search firms have a reputation for kind of recycling the same old candidates,
mhm.
which are going to look kind of the same. And also, I think it's being willing to fight for it. I mean, not too long ago, I actually had to tell a client, no, you really need to meet this person. You need to meet her, and it will not be a waste of your time. You have to trust me on this. You need to meet her. And he called me after the interview. He goes, "Oh, you are 100% right." So I think you do need to have champions, and I'm always happy to do that.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. I want to pivot a little bit because we have an audience of hiring managers, and we have an audience of prospects. I'd love just to hear about the landscape of what you've seen for women in terms of how, like, either the differences that you see or some of the challenges or opportunities that you see for women as they go through processes, either working with an executive recruiting firm or interviewing and being hired. Like, what are some of the gaps that, I mean, we're obviously addressing a lot of the gaps, right? But in specific to the process, the focus area of yours, what are some of the opportunities that you see for women?
Um, the good news is I think this is starting to push past the optics only phase. I think there is you look at, as long as this person is as high as quality and as good, then I think there is becoming more of a real opportunity. We still have to deal with some misogynistic leaders, but happy to say I think there is more of an appetite that's real. Um, I always think that one of the challenges has been men can live their lives very linearly, meaning you can go to school, you can have a relationship, you can start a job, you can start a family, you can get promoted, anything. You can be on that same line, right? Women, I think, have a much more cyclical kind of lifespan, which tends to be usually very rich. It's usually great, a little harder to navigate. And the fact that when women start to have children, they physically have children, and that means, you know, carrying a pregnancy and how exhausting I for kids, how, what that's about. And then delivery and post delivery and getting your body back and trying to, and you're supposed to stay on to all this stuff. Um, even, moving into when you have young kids at home and the pressures on that. Women historically face many more than men, even the best men in these relationships. And I think that tends to fall when a lot of career advancement is happening.
Mhm.
So it is much harder, I think, just for women to navigate, just by the laws of nature. The other things, and it got it'll be interesting to see what will happen, Brooke, after all this remote, now hybrid working, if that's going to make it better or not.
Mhm.
For, luckily I didn't have, you had to go through that with your kids when they were all home from school, but
Mhm.
I thank God I didn't, because woo, that would have been a lot to handle. But I do think the flexibility of some of that might be helpful, because a lot of jobs that notoriously helped you advance in career, I mentioned sales before, requires some travel, marketing control, so how do you fit that in, and if you have more flexibility and so forth. So um I think it's interesting times, but I think women have more to navigate.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk to our members about is presenting yourself with a unique value proposition. So really focusing not on sort of like what you do, the role of your job
Yeah.
and the tasks that you do every day, but the unique value that you bring. And that can feel really uncomfortable because it feels braggadocious, or it feels like even if it's 100% factually accurate, right? It's just uncomfortable for many women to put themselves out there. I, I have a theory that that shows up in negotiation, right? And I think it's my favorite negotiating book is Women Don't Ask. I just think it's a wonderful wonderful book. But I'd love to know what you see there
Yeah.
from the candidate side, from the company side, right? And what you would encourage our listeners, how you would encourage our listeners to think about negotiation, because obviously you're involved in negotiations every day.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to get to negotiation, but to circle back to what you said earlier, I think that it's very interesting to me how few people know how to tell their story.
Yeah.
And it's really important. I put resumes in front of clients every day, and I can tell you sometimes there's like a you know
Right.
they look at the top line thing and the years you've been employed and your titles and so forth. But what I do for my clients is tell the story, why they're meeting this candidate, kind of encapsulating this is what they're about, this is why they're in front of you, these are areas I think would bring great values, these are areas I'd like to explore a little bit more, right? That is what clients find the most value to me, because they have a hard time doing it. So if you're working with an executive recruiter who's not doing that, or if you're doing it on your own, I think it's really important that you do the work, so that when whoever you're, because usually you interview with like, oh, an internal recruiter or HR, and then you might move up, and then you're gonna, so by the end of that interview, that person, you should be able to spoon feed them, this is what this person's about and why we should look at her. I mean, and you have to do that. They'll have your resume, so don't use the time to recite your resume.
Right.
You should be able to say, I'm an experienced marketer who worked in this, this, and this. I've brought growth to what I was doing, and so that they can take notes. And then they ask, hey, should we interview that person again? And I go, yes, they're an experienced marketer who's done this,
Mhm.
this, and this. And you need to do that, because people are so busy. They're using algorithms to look at searches. We're looking for a new EA, and so we put, we're search people, but we don't search at that level. We do senior level. And my wonderful associate said, I'm going to just put an ad on LinkedIn and Indeed, see what happens. First 2 days, we had like 3,000 applicants. 3,000. It was overwhelming to us, and it's what we do for a living.
Right.
And and most of them were off. They were not the right thing at all. So I don't know if there is just systems putting names out there and just driving people to these postings. But this is why we never post jobs. But it just made me realize people who are using that to get talent, you've got to figure out how to stand out. And that means you have to tell your story. And it's your value position. And I would go even further. It's your value for that company. Look at what they're looking for. Use their terminology, not making things up, making it real, but know what part of yourself to highlight to make it easier for them to advance you. Because that's the clutter from that is very, very difficult. So yes, I agree with that. Negotiation. I'm going to make a couple of really broad generalizations because not all women are bad negotiators. I don't want to say that, but there are certain things I've heard over my career that have almost entirely come from women candidates versus male candidates. And it typically is some version of this. Well, I'm really interested in this job. I don't really want to make less money, but I guess I could for the right opportunity. What? Why would you start there? And it's a very I don't know where that comes from, except I see it a lot. And I usually counsel women through that because I don't believe in it.
Yeah. I thank you for sharing the piece about telling your story. I remember this was like a junior level hire, and I wouldn't have had a deep conversation with this candidate, but that they put on their resume that they knew how to lasso a steer. Like they had grown up in Wyoming, and I was like, that's so, like, I just wanted to understand, like, well, that's cool. Like, tell me about that. Tell me about your, I'd love to hear about, like, we can be so vulnerable, we can be so available, we can be so, we could share so much, and there's such a thing as oversharing, and there's such a thing as undersharing, right? And I've often got the feedback that people want more of me, like they want me to share more about myself, because for a long time I was like work. So I'm working on that personally. But how do you suggest, for all of us, right, when we think about building our personal brands, when we think about telling our stories, integrating the stuff of our lives when we know sometimes having little kids is more arduous for women, or sometimes, sometimes there are pieces of my story that I don't want to share. Like, so how do you recommend, or what have you seen work in terms of an attractive sharing as opposed to a restrictive sharing?
Yeah, it is really, I think it is really tricky. I think you need to read the room, right? I think you can't take this is who I am, one approach to everything. I think it's important that people get a sense of who you are, and because people do care about that. Employers care about energy. They care about presence. They care about if you can communicate effectively. And that's in every job. It's not just in marketing. It's not just in sales. It is everything. I think there are certain, again, I think understanding a company's culture, if it's very, you can usually read a lot about what they're about, and there's a lot of resources. And I think it's good to understand if it's someplace, and then, but I think it's selective. I think it's knowing which parts of yourself. I think it can still be tricky to talk about kids early on.
Mhm.
I don't think anyone should hide it. First of all, companies shouldn't ask you about that, but if it comes up, it shouldn't be, a problem. People have children. Um, but then if you have really good childcare, you should work that into the conversation. I think if you're doing an interview and you have a baby at home, ask someone to help you out for 45 minutes to an hour, because a baby crying behind you doesn't mean that we don't haven't all faced that in an emergency call and the baby's crying. But if it's an interview, then I see that as almost a judgment call. Is that if your childcare felt, then reschedule that meeting or that
Right.
interview.
Right.
And again, it's not that you're not allowed to have children, and the
Yeah.
children don't cry, but it's judgment. And I
Yeah.
think companies want you to know, oh, you're very professional and you'll use good judgment, not that you're
Hmm.
not human.
Hmm.
So, I think there's a lot of things. I think that interesting comment things can help. I think being able to find something to connect with,
Right.
having questions about the company is important and what this is about. Um, not, I remember someone saying, I go, do you have questions? And they said, do they offer free dry cleaning? And I'm like, yeah, not a good question.
Yeah.
So,
I I think the point
have
about
good questions.
judgment's a really, I mean, that's just a great way to frame it. I will share that I actually went to an interview for a really exciting role like 4 weeks after I had a baby, and it turned out like I had a fever. I was like but I was so excited about this role. I was like, yeah, of course I can do it. And um I 100% could have scheduled that way later, one because I had just had a baby, but also because I was like the first candidate they were seeing, and I was just anxious to get it going, and also I like to like make things happen. Anyway, I just having had that experience, like it would have been
Oh,
way better. I would have presented better. We would have had a better conversation. Um, I would have felt better, all of
yeah,
those things. And I think like so often it can feel so high stakes, right? That you just sort of want to be the yes person. And I think, we work with a lot of our members too on just like kind of people pleasing behaviors, right? But I think to your point, it's also an asset to have that good judgment, right? And to manage your time and your resources and your availability in a way that ensures that you'll set yourself up for success. So I love the way
exactly.
you frame that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's okay. It's professional. People are
Yeah,
busy. This doesn't work. How about this and this?
right,
It's just, it is having that confidence that they're not going to say, nope, that's it. Never again.
right, right,
Okay.
right, right. And if they do, that's a finding too, right?
It
That's
is. It
yeah,
is.
yeah,
Tells you a lot.
yeah. Um, so one of the things we talk also a lot about leveraging, your community and leveraging your network. And as I mentioned, you and I met quite a long time ago, and we've touched base on a lot of different things over the years. We talk about being an investor, not a trader, when it comes to relationships, right?
Right.
So it's
Right.
these are not transactional conversations. I'm a big proponent of take every recruiter call, even if you're not in the market, not because like I want everybody to be on the job hunt all the time, but because I think there's value in having those relationships. And often you can like,
Absolutely.
we've networked on many, many, many roles that,
Oh, yeah.
don't, that are maybe in my space, but not for me. I'd love to know, like, one, how do you build successful relationships? And then two, what advice do you have for our listeners in terms of, what's worked for you and what you think could work better
Yeah.
in the world writ large?
Yeah. And I think you're smart, Brooke. It's really smart to take, look at, not that if you're going to call every minute, that's annoying, but if there are people and trust, and take those calls. I will say CEOs are more likely to take my calls to know what's going on in the world,
Mhm.
because we're all busy in our jobs. So if you keep your head down and then all of a sudden you look up and it's 10 years later and you're like, oh, okay. So I
Totally.
think having these conversations, be it with executive recruiters or with people within the industry, it helps you, oh, what are you looking for in your company, and what skill sets are being valued, and should you be doing some education in a certain area? I do a lot in tech, and those skills are changing exponentially. And so it's good to kind of do a check-in, even if it's like, no, I'm happier with where I'm at. What a
Hmm.
good thing to be able to tell yourself, versus, like, oh, I don't even like this job. I've been
Hmm.
in this whole
Hmm.
time. So I think that's always a really smart thing to do. Networking is, and I agree, I love how you say it's not transactional. I think it is really, you know, interesting. It's to meet people who you can hopefully respect, who you can learn from. Um, I think that it needs to be done spherically. I think you need to network within your company at as many levels as possible. There are people in these organizations thinking that some of the senior people don't want to talk to them. And the
Hmm.
reality is, senior people should know who the good people are coming up, so
Totally.
that when names are put in front of them for promotion, they go, oh, yeah, I know her. And yeah, that's okay. So it's part of their jobs, and you shouldn't see a divide with that. I think also it's really important to go cross functionally, that you don't have to stay in your own area. I think it's important to understand what's going on in finance and marketing and sales and tech. And if you can talk to people who are in these different areas, better for you to do your job better, right? You're not just looking at what one piece of the elephant. That was that old study. I think it's also we're coming into some interesting times where I'm seeing talent being pulled into different industries that people didn't think they'd end up working with when they
True.
started, right? So um, sport, we're seeing they've been pulling people from entertainment for a while, and vice versa. And if you are looking at, marketing is a really interesting area, right? For some more traditional businesses, companies that are further ahead in areas like what was then digital marketing, which is now just marketing.
Hmm.
Um, but audience acquisition, and some of these are really high in different areas, and so long as they can adjust to the culture, we're
Hmm.
seeing more of this, which gives you more career opportunities. So I think networking outside your company is important. I think I, I have my kids now in their 20s, and I've encouraged them to look at nonprofits. A lot of the nonprofits, the museums, things have junior boards that do a
Hmm.
lot of good things, right? And Urban Gateways is one. I was on there. That's a arts education nonprofit in Chicago, and they have a great young person board. Steppenwolf Theater has one. The museums have them, and they're usually social. They're usually fun
Hmm.
kind of things. Companies often support their people doing this kind of philanthropic work within their communities, and you'll meet people outside your traditional sphere.
Hmm.
I think alumni associations to use some of that. But I do think that the networking piece is important. Something came up, I'll have to ask your opinion about it this week. So this gets back into internal networking. Um, I put together a football pool. I work in the company. We do a lot in the sports industry, and all my colleagues in the UK and in Europe, big into sports, and they have their own thing. And I'm like, hey, North America wants in the action, so we put one together around the NFL. And I made it really, really, really simple. Right? We're not picking teams. We're not doing point spreads. It's really for fun. It's just pick a team, and then we're doing different fun things around it. And this week I had to reach out to some of the younger women on the team. We're like, I don't follow football. And they're like, they're not going to do it. And I'm like, I don't think that's why we're doing it. So, I mean, do you think it's important to participate in things like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we've had that question from companies like, are there, I think there like some things like make sure there are non-alcoholic options at company get right, like
Totally.
they're totally and sports can be a lightning rod because it's been so traditionally male, right? That we've seen some people just say no, not interested. But I think, yeah, I think you're like when you think about it as a participation, as an opportunity, to sort of get closer. I mean, I can share like just the one. I had an experience of speaking on a panel where as I walked out, they handed me a gift bag with a men's large golf shirt in it. And I was like, oh, like
Yeah,
one, I don't golf,
thanks.
two, I'm not a man, three, like it just made, and by the way, I was like one of the only women in the room. It was, so I sent them a note and I just said, look, like this just makes me feel like this is not a room for me. Like this room is, and they were like, they're super apologetic. They think it was extra swag. We were trying to, whatever the reasons are. I think, if there's I think if you're trying to create unity around an activity,
Yeah,
I think there's some upfront questioning just about is it going to do it. But I think it's worth having that conversation with those employees, and
yeah.
just
Well,
understanding.
and to be fair, I'm doing one on the Tonys and I'm doing one on the
Yeah.
Academy
So right,
Awards,
right.
and but it is an interesting thing. And I think generationally, it's been a shift. I mean, I
I think
learned
so too.
golf because I hated that I was left out of so many things. A good friend of mine drinks scotch to this day because she was in this group. There, all the men are drinking scotch, and they said, "Oh, you want a glass of white wine?" And she's like, "No, I drink scotch." And she said, "I learned
Right.
to drink scotch." I don't think people have to do that today,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I do think opportunities to connect that, and you're right. I think and I think that there's a lot of reasons that companies are walking back from a lot of the happy hour party
Hmm.
things because it's dangerous. It's dangerous for women on lots of levels.
Yeah.
I always suggest to women that they should always have an event after like a 2 hours. Like
Yeah. That's a
go to your
good
Christmas
call.
parties, go to the thing, but because people get a little too comfortable, things happen. It's dangerous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
no, these are important things to think of, and it's also not feeling excluded. I think if it was only sport, then it would be something,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting thing that I think we're still wrestling with.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the important thing is for like each individual to evaluate each opportunity, right? And like, is this an opportunity for me to connect with someone I want to connect with? And even if I just like think football is vapid and ridiculous, if the person who's going to help me get to the next level, who I want to be my sponsor, right, is
Right?
engaged in this, what if I looked at this as, can I spend some time with that person by saying, I don't know anything about fantasy football and I want your help, right? And
Yeah,
like that's a warm in entree as opposed to saying, I definitely don't want anything to do with it. And I think part of the muscle generationally is part of the shift is like, I think for many of us who grew up during a time where there were even fewer women at the table, right? You were just kind of constantly on the lookout, like, how can I navigate my
yeah,
way there? Um, and so I think there's like a scrappiness to that and thinking about how do you frame this. On the other hand, if I'm not a drinker, I'm not going to a bar or for an event. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
so I think we each have to have our own limits, but I think your
Yes,
counsel in terms of thinking about like how can I look at this as an opportunity is also really important for people to consider. And if it's just something that's just like PU, I can't handle it, then like that's your decision, right?
totally.
Um, and then
Yeah,
think
if it's
about
an
another way you can,
ethical or moral,
yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
And I think it's, you know, one of the things that I think is better. I mean, I've been working on a really long time. When I was coming up in my career, more of the women were um, more territorial, the ones that had made it, because they did not want to help who was coming next and give them a
right,
hand and develop
right,
that because there was one of us. We have one of those. That's all we need, right? We had that. And so there was more internal competition among women.
Mhm.
I do think that's gotten better.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe it's just with some of my colleagues. I mean, one of the reasons that Will and I wanted to move to SRI was there was a lot of really great young people that we wanted to develop and help develop their talent. So I think we're seeing more of that,
Mhm.
although women should look at not only more senior women as mentors, but they should look at men because some
Yep.
of my best champions have been men.
Yeah, no, same here. And we talk about that a lot in terms of, and especially, I mean, for people with many intersections, like it's very unlikely that you're going to find someone who's exactly like you, who's going to sort of take you under their wing, just because the more diverse we get, the fewer of us there are. Um, so I think that's really important. And then I also think just, you know, that one of the gaps that we observe is like navigational skills, right? Like I've never been in this environment. I don't understand these codes. I don't understand this technology. There's just that's one of the reasons that women and people of color feel like they're working twice as hard to go half as far, right? Because it's just like there's time, there's investment time that needs to be spent on, well, I don't know, do I golf, right? And like your friend, she probably spent some time like learning to like scotch before she,
Yeah,
right? But that was time that maybe someone who had grown up drinking scotch wouldn't have had to spend and was spending doing other things, right? And so how do we create environments where we can welcome sort of a multitude of different experiences, right?
yes,
And really value people for what they bring to the table. I think that like that's the question.
right.
And I think you're right. We're all a work in progress there, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, okay, so I have actually talked to a couple of your kids. I've talked to, yeah, two of your kids in their job searches. I'd love to
Thank
know
you for
what.
that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. They're wonderful like you. But what did you tell them when they went out to go attack that? And I know like there was COVID, there were lots of different things for each
Yeah.
of them. But like what advice do you give your kids when on the job search?
Um, well, I I actually think it's really important to, and it's probably starting before that, right? I've talked to a lot of kids of clients and friends, who, my advice is typically read everything you can, talk to everybody you can, ask them what they do, keep
Hmm.
learning. Um, I think it's having good follow up. Um, I think a job hunt, we live with so many tools, and it's very easy to just push out 100 resumes or 100 email. But the more connection you can make, you're going to have so much more progress, and it's going to serve everybody better. So, um, 100 emails probably worth, 10 good phone calls and probably one good meeting.
Right.
I think there's a little, not with my kids will talk to anybody, but I think they're generationally, it's like, the big joke, if you want to turn a millennial off, you call them,
Right.
you just, so I think it's kind of getting out of your comfort zone and being
Mhm.
able to have these conversations and talk to people and to follow up. Send a thank you note. Very few people do this now. It's a very odd thing. Very few people, even at the levels that I work, like
Do
across
you
the
mean
C-suite.
handwritten or like
Nope,
just an email?
nope, not
Really?
even that,
Nobody does?
Brooke. An email is
Oh,
totally fine. A text would do. I'd
nothing.
say 10%. I'm
Huh.
really shocked. I mean, back in the day, and I remember people, but I helped get jobs and they actually sent me flowers.
Yeah.
I remember them, but I'm really happy with thank you notes. And it doesn't
Right.
have to be the old kind where you had stationery and a stamp and you had to send it out.
Yeah.
An email, people don't do it.
Yeah. I had another podcast conversation. We talked to because I was I have like childhood guilt about handwritten thank you notes. Like I have to, it's like a compulsion for me because it was so prioritized. But I think actually a handwritten note is something that can really differentiate you. Not because
Totally.
you're old fashioned or whatever, but because like it just signals like you took the time, it mattered to you. And obviously email is great, but sometimes even I'll send an email saying like proper thank you note to file, like kind of as a joke, because I can't help myself with the handwritten because, but
You were
I think
raised very well, Brooke.
I don't know about that. I just was, yeah, that was a compulsion. But I think thinking about, I mean, I think this is such a big part of what we're talking about in terms of communicating your value and telling your story, right? Thinking about different ways, like if you're seeing 3,000 resumes for your EA, right? What is going to make any one of those people stand out to you, right? Knowing that you're
Right.
in. And so if it is a handwritten note, if it is flowers, if it is like a text, like what do you think it is? But that also takes investment on the job seeker's end, right, to understand kind of what matters to you, right,
Yeah.
or take those, and maybe it won't pay off, maybe it will, but it's a risk worth taking, in terms of the way that you're defining yourself. So
Yeah.
so I'm not encouraging everybody to write handwritten thing, but
Or
I am
send
encouraging
flowers. And
everyone, or something,
I'm not
right,
saying
right,
that either,
but
but I do think you're right. It's I read somewhere that Princess Diana, before she went to all these events she went to, she would have note cards and envelopes the pre-written on her desk. So in the morning she could send a
just
handwritten
signing.
note, which would probably carry a ton of weight from her, right? I mean, but even still, I thought, okay, that's really interesting. But I do think, but this gets back to what we were saying earlier about telling your story, because it's another opportunity, right? To say, I mean, especially if it's a job or something where you're saying, thank you so much for your time. And I enjoyed our conversation about XYZ. This is an area I'm really interested in developing, and I hope I can do it with your company or something. It gives you another chance in a nice way, and a not like, um, but people need to do their homework. I
Hmm.
get a lot of unsolicited resumes, and and the big knock against executive recruiters is like, oh, I send these things out and I never hear from them. But I will tell you, I'll get things from heavy manufacturing. And I'm like, did you even look at the website? My
Right.
bio tells you what I recruit in, right? So you're feeling, oh my God, I'm sending all these things out to recruiters. You're sending them to the wrong people.
Hmm.
Do your homework, look at their LinkedIn's, look at their websites. Is this a person that you should try to approach? And what should you be saying that shows, hey, I work in this area. I know you work in this area. Can we talk?
Yeah.
I get a lot of stuff that is clearly one-sided, one side fits all kind of, and it just
Hmm.
goes into the junk.
Yeah, totally. Totally. That actually one reason I like email follow-ups is because I can link like, have you read this or have you listened to this podcast, based on the conversation that we had.
Yeah,
So that's an opportunity, like you can actually offer some value, right? Whether or not it goes the way that you want it to, you can offer some value. So
right.
yeah, I think that's really good advice. Thank you. All right, I
Thank
want
you.
to do,
My kids never thank me for my advice, so you're welcome.
okay, so I'm doing I'll send them all emails and say, "Hey, you should really thank your mom." We're as you know, we have 3 kids who are not in the gratitude phase of life, so really have to thank each other. Okay, I'm gonna do our lightning round questions. Is there anything else that you would like to share or say that we didn't cover?
No, I don't think so. I was just trying to, I think, the only thing I will say is I'm a huge supporter of Beyond Barriers. I think the work you're doing is so important, and I am so excited to help in any way I can.
Thank
I
you.
believe in it.
Thank you. We believe in the work you're doing too, and I've seen the results. So, and I'm part of the results. So, thank you. We're excited
Well,
to be
you're
partners
welcome. And
together
yeah, no, and your kids will also be very thankful too. I will say my
someday.
daughter no, she's in her 20s now, and she's like, she's thinking I'm much smarter than I used to be. So it'll work
Someday.
out.
Someday. Okay, so can you tell me about a book that has greatly influenced you?
Love books. The book I have been referring to the most is lately is Radical Candor by Kim
Mm,
Scott. Have you read that one?
hmm.
So it's really about the importance of timely criticism, but also praise, which I
Right.
think sometimes managers lose in the whole thing. The other thing, and this is across the board, this isn't just women, this is men as well. I've seen this where they don't get on things soon enough. And
Mm,
so radical candor is about identifying things early, good and bad. And if
mhm,
there's something as a manager that you've identified, you say, hey, I've noticed this, you need to address this and we need to work on that and make that better. Then if it continues, you escalate it up a little bit and said, hey, we talked about this. What are you doing? Do you need help with some strategies? This has to be addressed.
mhm,
And then if not, you know, they're on, if you have to fire somebody, you're not
mhm.
faced with this, but you never told me, and I
Right.
had no idea. I had perfectly good evaluations, which often happens, right?
Mhm.
So it's not brutal honesty, but it is honesty and it is candor. And I think that the best managers I have that skill.
Yeah. Excellent. Do you have a favorite inspiring quote or say?
Um, I do. I think I have many. I asked my one friend that I've known my whole life, I go, is there a quote I say a lot? And she goes, you like the Gloria Steinem one about, Fred Astaire did, and Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and high heels. But the one that I've been going to more lately is from Maya Angelou. And
Mm,
it's do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. I
so
love that
good.
quote. And I think
Yeah.
that applies to a lot of things, especially in our changing ecosystems and as people learn what experiences people are going through who might be different than you,
Mhm.
do better.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Um, what is one word or moniker that you would use to describe yourself?
My boss calls me a connector. So I think that's a good word, connector.
Excellent. I love it. And what's one change or habit that you implemented that made your life better?
I stopped saying sorry so much. I think, like a lot of women, I was raised to be a pleaser you know, sorry, but I don't understand it. And I've learned to stop saying sorry. Now, it does not mean I won't apologize. I will readily apologize when I'm wrong, and that happens all the time. But the sorries as a gap filler, get rid of those. They don't serve you.
Love it. And then what's your power song to walk up on stage?
Brooke, I would say probably anything from Bruce Springsteen.
Awesome.
um, um, how about Girl is on Fire, Alicia Keys.
Yeah, good one. I love that song. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a treat. It's always good to talk to you, but it's been great just to have this conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brooke. I really enjoyed talking to you as always.
Likewise.